Hey folks, welcome back to COVID Chats. This is episode 32 with my guest Thomas Struat-Collard. Thomas is the manager of operations at a graduate school of education. So we discuss that educational element a bit, but more in terms of trends and how he sees maybe the future of education changing a bit. I know I've had many different people from the education sector on this program, whether it be teachers or administrators. So I try to approach it from a different angle, and I think it's a unique discussion. It's not one that we've had directly on this program before. Thomas is also a Brooklyn native, so we discuss, how there's less new apartment leases now. That was something I read in Morning Brew, which we talk about a bit on the program, and also how he thinks this will affect gentrification, and if this will maybe change that a bit. Brooklyn was becoming actively gentrified, basically all parts of Brooklyn, but perhaps this will shift those trends a bit. A lot of people are leaving New York now. Some are leaving to second homes. Of course, not everybody has that, and those people will come back likely at some point. But there's still the interesting angle of, will people be moving into the city as much? So we explore that a bit. And Thomas was also interested in the markets and politics, and those are fun angles to talk about. It's not too heavy an episode, so don't worry if you're not in the mood for a downer. This one isn't, in my opinion. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. So here it is, episode 32. Hello, Thomas, and welcome to episode 32 of COVID Chats.
Hey, Ruben, thanks for having me.
Of course, a pleasure. Great to have you on the program. This is a relatively big milestone for me, 2 months into the COVID Chats program. So that's nice. Of course, 2 months in the grand scheme of things, not that much, but still good headway for me. It's been a pleasure talking to people. Very happy to have you on.
Yeah, it's great. I recommend everyone like and subscribe Ruben's videos on YouTube.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I haven't pushed the liking and the subscribing too much because, a fear of mine when I started was that people were going to think I was, trying to capitalize on the moment and, spurn a giant channel out of this. And that was never my goal with this. It was almost a selfish thing of like, oh, I just want to talk to people as long as I'm going to be inside for all this time. But,
Yeah.
but yes, no,
Exactly.
like and subscribe. That's huge. Thank you. So, I'd like to start the program off with all my guests with just a how are you? How are you doing?
I'm good. I mean, I'm a little bored nowadays, but work has been keeping me busy, and family and friends are all safe, so can't complain.
Hmm,
Um, yeah, that's really it.
sure.
You know.
Yeah. How's it out in Brooklyn when you go out? Are a lot of people? Everyone's wearing masks and gloves and such.
Thankfully, a lot of people are still wearing masks. There are the relative few that, just opt out. But yeah, walking on the streets, pretty empty. Going to the store, 6 feet in line. Even in the grocery store, they started making directions that you could only walk in one way, which is
Right.
great. So you don't have to pass someone
Right.
as you're, getting your groceries. But yeah, so far it's all right. I think we're starting to see more people come outside as the weather's getting better.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you see the images of the parks, like I think it's getting, it's growing pretty fast
Oh yeah.
actually, and that's
Yeah.
concerning, especially
Yeah.
in New York State.
Definitely big concern, especially for us right in New York State, and especially here in the city where this county has been hit, arguably the hardest in the world.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's not a good sight to see the parks being packed. I've seen it firsthand on my bike. I try to avoid the parks per se, but if you bike adjacent to the park, you see it firsthand. The people are out there about. They are not wearing masks. They are not social distancing. They're passing around stuff. So,
Yeah, it even seems like park attendance has probably increased,
oh,
honestly. Like
definitely.
even because of the good weather, but season over season, like I don't know, it's crazy. There's people that are like 6 feet away, but they're with a group of friends and they're not socially distant. So, and
Right,
they don't live together. It's pretty
right,
obvious. Yeah.
right. Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult thing. I've talked about it with different people of like, people who live alone or don't have a, aren't living with their family, or they're not a parent who has their small cluster of a family, they feel like they have to create, these are the people who I'm going to be around during this, and these are the people I'm not going to be around. But then, somebody else wants to join that day, or they come, it's an impossible scenario for people, I think. And then when it turns also to the good weather, it's just, it amplifies, and it's scary to see. I hope people continue to be safe, but I also think about it on the flip side too, of how long can it be maintained, right? How long can we expect people to stay home? Can we Are we supposed to just shift our entire culture, and expect, this fear and this vigilance to, stay safe, to maintain for an an undue and an unknown period of time? I mean, it's kind of an impossible thing.
I mean, that's the thing. I think as someone who, we're fine right now. We're safe. I have a job. I have an apartment. I haven't been laid off because of the economic downturn. Like, we should do all that we can to stay inside
Right.
because we should be leaving as much space possible for essential workers.
Right.
And by going to a park and, sitting with our friends, I don't necessarily think it's the best use of our time. We could be doing that on Zoom. I've been having a lot of Zoom calls with friends or my family. I've only seen my parents once in the past, I don't even know, I guess 2 months, and that was just to help them out with something that they really needed
Right.
help with. So it's hard, honestly, but then you go into the details and there's people who have issues like making money or their mental state's not right, and you dig into the details. It just gets more tangled up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's also, there's the people who are actually fighting this on the front line, the healthcare workers, those essential workers. Of course, there's many different types of essential workers, but specifically the healthcare workers and the doctors who are seeing this firsthand. I mean, I'm sure, when they think about people going to the park, it's just, it's ludicrous in their mind. It's very hard. I think the dissonance between that, between people who are really actively fighting this and people who are just kind of maintaining and work from home, and are a little bored, as you said, and they're like, what am I supposed to do here?
Yeah, and even those that have escaped the city, I mean, thankfully, I'm in a place in the city where I don't think the population is too dense. But I mean, if you look at the data, at least what I've been reading recently is that the wealthiest neighborhoods or the wealthiest zip codes in New York City have essentially like cleared out for the most part and gone to a vacation home where, like,
Absolutely.
kudos to them, they have the money to do that, but there's risks involved in spreading the disease further I
Right.
mean, the virus further.
Right.
And, we have to think about those that can't and don't have that ability.
Right. Yeah, no, a lot of
So
the
I think we
contact tracing
froze.
has shown that part of the spread to the rest of the country was due to people fleeing New York. And I actually want to follow up with you towards the end of this about people leaving the city, and your thoughts on how, maybe, gentrification in New York and particularly in Brooklyn will be affected. But before we get there,
Mhm.
I want to talk about Brooklyn on a smaller level, particularly your apartment, which I see in the background, a lovely apartment I've spent some time in. What's it like living in sort of a relatively small Brooklyn apartment right now? Did you have any thoughts about wanting to move back home? And is your roommate around?
That's a great question. My roommate, first of all, usually travels. He's a consultant, so he's usually on the road, sometimes internationally or another state, but we're both home. It's a two-bedroom, so at least we're not like, constantly, we have a space to go to and we have a living room, but it is a relatively small apartment, and getting outside is important, but obviously, like, with the right precautions and masks and going when, the hours of the day don't have a lot of people outside. But yeah, I've been finding other hobbies to do during the downtime. I've been picking up reading, cooking more. So it's been distracting for the most part, but thankfully money's still coming in, so it's not really too much of uh, too much on my plate.
Right.
No.
So is your roommate home, or he stayed elsewhere?
Yeah, he's home. He's in his room right now.
Oh, very
He's
nice.
actually from he's from India. He's not He's living here temporarily, I think, but
Hmm.
for the most part he works here. He's been working and living here for a really long time, and yeah.
And yeah, well, you mentioned, trying to go out in parts of the day that aren't so crowded. When have you found to be a good time to go out?
I mean, we've been going to the grocery store on Saturdays. The earlier you go, depending on the store, is typically better, but
Yeah.
sometimes we can't squeeze it in our day because we're doing other things, so then we'll just go later. But then again, weekends are also the busiest times.
Right.
So I think in terms of limiting times of day might be hard, but the amount, like the frequency of which you go out. So, for example, I think there was one week I didn't go outside at all, like once, and that can be taxing to my
Yeah.
mental state, obviously.
Yeah.
But even if it's just going outside, standing in front of your apartment doors at 10 p.m. to get fresh air, that helps a lot, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah. I mean, you have a nice little stoop. You're on the first floor, so it's easy for you to kind of just pop out for a little bit.
Yeah, and if I really needed fresh air, sometimes just going, taking the longboard or a bike and getting a quick ride in there, which seems like you've been doing too. Good use of time.
Yeah. Maybe a little too much, getting out too much, but
Yeah.
it's a balance, right? I mean, in part it's for the exercise, in part it's for the mental health, in part it's just for the fresh air. It's like one of the small reprieves we have is to be able to go outside and just take in a little bit of sunlight, a little vitamin D, which is really pretty essential, honestly, for our immune system also. So that's another facet of that. So, how have your thoughts on this pandemic sort of shifted over the course of these past 2 months? I know people were very gung ho about, Zoom happy hours when this first broke out, and everybody was so distraught over the news and the statistics. But as things have gone on, and cases are down and new infections are down, and it seems like we've done a decent job of flattening the curve here. How have your thoughts changed?
Well, I think the restrictions that were put in place were the right call. We should have acted a lot sooner, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, but they are what they are. The numbers are falling. You could say the curve is starting to flatten, but at the same time, I think if we ease restrictions, especially in areas of dense population, we might see an uptick. I think in northeastern China, that's what's happening. They're actually going back in lockdown,
Mm.
and they're not easing restrictions. They ease them already, and now they're kind of reverting back because the rate of infections are growing faster. So that's something that we have to live with, and we have to do it in moderation, especially in places where there's a lot of public activity like parks and museums. Like I'm afraid if we open up too soon that a second wave will come, and I'm sure, as you know, like the second wave, like for the Spanish flu, was worse than the first wave. So I think we should just be cognizant of how much we open up and the rate at which we do it.
It seems like, from what I've heard from some of the scientists and some of the doctors, it seems like a second wave is inevitable in the fall. That it will come back around. This will be something that we have to deal with going forward in perpetuity. Of course, once the vaccine arrives, a yearly vaccine or whatnot, or maybe every few years, like some other viruses we have to deal with. But yeah, no, it's very tough in the city. The city relies so much on activity and gathering, and I mean, from restaurants to live events. I mean, it's one of the reasons people want to be here. So I certainly, I understand it can't happen, but I also, I get that the compliance is just going to gradually slip, especially as the weather gets better. And, I fear the second wave, but I don't necessarily know how to stop that.
Yeah, I mean, most of our funding for unemployment, or at least at our state level, I think it runs out in like July or something, or at least the initiatives only go to that point. So even if we did have a second wave, even if it happens later in fall, we're going to need additional funding for those who lost their jobs, who
Right.
need to put food on the table. And I don't think it's going to be a New York State specific thing. I think we're going to start seeing this in other states too, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, the only benefit I see to there being sort of different state by state policies is that each state can be a test case of a certain sort, and we can see, what works, what doesn't. Of course, it's then hard to translate, one state to another, because in differences in density of populations and city layout and all of these in public transportation, all these many different factors. But at least we can kind of get different kinds of data that we can compare and analyze, and hopefully find some thread that runs through it to be like, this seems to be a better approach, this doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I think Texas recorded the most single day increase in cases yesterday or the day before,
Wow.
new cases, and they eased restrictions. And that's not to say that they don't deserve to ease restrictions. Like obviously, by all means, if they have the correct measures in place, but I think we need to make sure our politicians have our health in mind
Mhm.
before we start opening up things, at least in New York State.
Right. Yeah, and something Ira mentioned, a good friend of ours who was on COVID chats earlier, is that we should really just be listening to the scientists and the doctors on this one, and not the politicians. And that the politicians, I raised the point that oftentimes the politicians are a mouthpiece for the doctors and the scientists. Not always, but in an ideal world, that would be the case.
Well, I mean, yeah, definitely. I think our politicians are taking us to, are telling us that unapproved FDA drugs are necessarily the cure when they're not. I think we should definitely be leaning on experts as a source of information in this time, and politicians to just, do their jobs and do the best they can for the public, not necessarily providing non-factual information.
Right. Yeah. I think it's pretty clear you're talking about our president there.
I want to say it, but he hydroxychloroquine, is that it? I think he was
Hydroxychloroquine. Yeah, he said he's taking
chloroquine.
it or
Yeah,
something, right?
yeah, I said that today.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to find out.
Meanwhile, Cuomo, on the other hand, has been doing a great job by most people's accounts, and giving a very strong message out. So it's interesting to see some politicians are getting it done, and are getting it done the right way, and others are sticking to their roots, so to speak.
I wouldn't be surprised if Cuomo's going to make a 2024 moderate Democrat bid. Honestly, his popularity is really gaining.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that. They've asked him if he was going to run this time around. He said 100% no. So we'll see.
We'll
2024 is a
see.
long way
I
away.
mean, minds change.
That's true.
Nothing's off the table.
So you're a manager of operations at a graduate school for education. I've
Hmm.
had a couple of different teachers on, and most recently an administrator, actually, for an assistant. He's an assistant principal at a high school in Chicago. So I've discussed the educational element a little bit, but I think it's interesting for you as a manager of the operations. What have you been telling grad school students and future teachers to help them stay on track during this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one, we've tried to lax as much as we could. Like obviously, teaching from home has not been the easiest for some. For some students, it's been helpful, and for some teachers, they're able to get the knack of it pretty quickly. But for a large portion, it's been something difficult. Like this transitionary phase from 100% in person, especially with uh, adolescents and you know students who are between kindergarten and fifth grade. Like
Mhm.
it's something they've never had to deal with before, and it's also a struggle for parents too, in terms of
Totally.
like getting online and making sure they're doing their work, and then you know leaving their room to go do their work from home, or if they're essential workers, like having caretakers while they're out and about trying
Hmm.
to put food on the table. But yeah, it's hard. And what we've done as an institution where I am is we've tried to do pass fail for the term.
Hmm.
Um, and we waived the presentation aspect for their master's, their equivalent of their master's thesis. And we've just been providing as much resources as we can. We've worked with our partners and New York City DOE, and we're just trying to get anything we can back out to the students so they can incorporate it as fast as they can. There's a lot of great ed tech out there. Um, Companies like Nearpod make it easier, obviously Zoom, but at the end of the day, like getting someone to sit at a screen, for, especially um, younger students, to
Yeah.
sit at a screen and learn is a lot harder than we probably could have imagined. And the future is going to look a lot different for education.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. I'm very curious about the future of education. Is the education curriculum changing to accommodate for trends and increased online learning?
I'm glad you're saying accommodating for increased trends. It's not going to be fully online. Like
Of course not.
in a world, yeah. And some have pushed the limit and jumped to that conclusion,
Yeah,
but
it's too far.
it's definitely going to accompany learning. You can
Yeah.
see like at-home advising, for example, or individual peer-to-peer teaching or tutoring. It's really hard. I mean, we take it for granted every day, but like just commuting takes up a large portion of our day. So going to school and not going to school, and after school programs, for example, can't run online. So there's going to have to be a balance between in person and online, but it's definitely going to shift. I think online education is the future to access remote areas and to expand education where it wasn't before, but I don't think it's a substitute for traditional education that's in person.
Right, right. No, certainly we still need in person. I'm curious, are you informing the people at your school to just sort of think about these trends and maybe shift some of the ways that we teach to accommodate for the fact that not everything is in person. The reason I mention this is because something the administrator who I had on the last episode was mentioned that there are things that a teacher will do in a classroom to sort of help a student that can only be done in person. Like a student is very talkative and he's having side conversations, he's not really paying attention. The teacher might sort of drift over to that part of the room so that and suddenly the student stops talking because he recognizes he can't get away with it. But that's not something possible over Zoom. So are they thinking about sort of out of the box ways to sort of replicate that in-person experience?
Yeah, we're in an interesting situation at my school. So we're an institute of higher ed, and students go there to get their masters. And specifically, it's an alternative route for education. So students who already have their bachelor's or masters and want to get into the teaching profession to fill that lack of supply in New York City teaching, that's what we provide. And our curriculum, like a large portion of it, is actually online too. So the teachers are pretty familiar with learning online. So it's actually like taking that information and like, I don't want to say trickle down, but I'm going to say it. It's trickling down to the students so they can uh, get the best information possible. We're kind of in the reactionary phase for the most part. I
Mm-hmm.
think we'll obviously be more proactive once this settles down and how we can incorporate it for like best use and yeah, that's really it.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we're thinking of our students and our students
Right.
because we're an institute of higher ed. So for the most part, we're just looking at when should they return in terms of the DOE and when should they return to their actual classes, and then
Mm-hmm.
trying to incorporate as much as the online learning model as much as possible right now that we
Sure.
can.
Makes sense. Yeah. What's the latest word from the DOE? Does it seem like things will be back in the fall, or is it still unclear?
It's still unclear. I'm waiting for them to publish their calendar, but for the most part, obviously everyone knows like New York City DOE closed schools for this year.
Right.
It seems like summer's going to be impacted, and that's like a huge blow because for the summer, it's a lot of lower income students who have summer school or certain programs where there's students where their families can work. And then if it trickles into the fall, it's going to be even harder. And I can't even imagine. It's a world we don't want to go into, but they're starting to plan for it.
Right. Yeah, I think we kind of have to plan for it just in case that is the reality. But a
Yeah.
little too soon to say right now.
Yeah.
With many higher education universities being online in the fall, California State universities, a bunch of them will be strictly online or at least, largely online. How do you see higher education changing? Do you think like tuition will have to be reduced? I mean, that we've seen trends of tuition just gradually rising. I mean, I know during my time at Rutgers, it increased by, less than 1% every year, regardless of the fact that the education remained the same. It wasn't like it got 1% better. So how do you see some other changes going on the non-learning side, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, that might have been more inflationary based, but
Well,
in terms of like costs falling, uh, I mean, the New York State DOE is also cutting their funding to certain programs. They launched something about that recently, but in terms of the model changing, I could see it getting obviously just cheaper over time as things like the quality improves, but the largest overhead cost is still teachers. That for Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're still underpaid. They still are trying to get certification requirements. Um, they're in the low income needs, like in terms of like charter networks and public schools. Like it's not an easy place to teach. It's challenging, so they're going to need ongoing professional development. So the thing with teaching, it doesn't stop after you graduate. Like it keeps going, and you need constant tools to adapt your knowledge. And that's the thing. I mean, even if as you get a degree or your master's or doctorate, or even like initially when you got your bachelor's, it was expensive. And at the same time, what goes into that is the same thing that you see when you come out and then you're teaching. It's high overhead for um, teachers, and that's the most part. But at yeah, and in terms of like the OECD, like other rich countries, our spending is the highest, but we have some of the worst scores in math and ELA. And I think I don't want to get too philosophical, but you could see how much we spend on other things, and it's just a question of budgeting, really.
right. Well, I would never want someone to not get philosophical on this program, but I do understand what you're saying. It's that is definitely a larger conversation about the way we spend money in this country, what
Yeah.
we give our money to. The military, of course, being a glaring
I mean,
example.
we could talk about that. Yeah, we spend 10 times on defense over
Um,
education.
yeah. It would be a good conversation. I have a bunch of other questions for you that I want to hit
No
though,
worries.
so we'll push forward on this. So in your personal life, you have an interest in the market and in politics, two different things, of course. But I've seen some postings of yours in our group chat with some other friends about shorting a stock here or investing in this here. How have you been taking advantage of the rise and fall of the stock market?
I wouldn't call it taking advantage of the rise and fall, just because honestly, I'm in the middle in terms of investing. There's those that have assets in the billions, or you're talking
Sure.
about BlackRock trillions. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make money where I can as someone in the middle class. But yeah, I've shorted, which is basically making money on it. To simplify it, is making money when prices fall. So if like the stock market falls, I find a way to make money. One of them was actually an international investment, but basically you can make some spare change for political failure, which I did. But at the same time, like it's obviously, I'd rather have markets, stabilize and everyone have their jobs than,
Right.
having to short or buy. I think we have a bubble right now, for example, in biotech, because a handful of companies are doing great things where several others probably won't see the life cycle of issuing that drug and going through small trials, large trials,
Right.
then manufacturing, distribution. Like for the most part, like they're overvalued. If you want to try to find value in there, go ahead, but
Hmm.
it's a tricky game, honestly.
Yeah. No, certainly. And I didn't use the term taking advantage in a negative light. I mean,
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah, of
no,
course.
no. I think it's reasonable to have an interest in the stock market, especially in a time like this. I mean, we were on a historic bull run, and then we kind of saw some of the shortcomings in these past 2 months. But certainly, it hasn't been as some people predicted. Like directly down across the board. Some companies have done well, but no, I mean, it's just interesting to note. I thought that little tidbit you just revealed about the biotech and how many companies there are overvalued just because everyone's on the vaccine craze, so they assume every company will just be worth tons because they're all racing for this. But
Yeah, I mean, as much as it is finance, it's really mostly psychology. All these bailouts coming every week by different countries, central banks. It's it's something to pay attention to, obviously, in the long run, and who knows how it's gonna to shape our economy. But for the most
Mhm.
part, I think that we're saying usually after following a recession, there's a decrease in inequality, but that's mostly because asset prices have suppressed to a certain point where the lower class actually, like the lower and middle classes, have seemed to have more wealth. But in actuality, asset prices eventually rise.
Mhm.
So I think we have to change the underlying structure of our economy in order to make it fair for when things do pick back up. But yeah, again, as someone in the middle class, like there is some money to be made if you have some idle cash lying around.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, a lot of people, they wanted to. Some people wanted to pull everything out when things went bad. Other people wanted to double down and put even more in while things were going down. So it's just interesting to talk about different strategies that people had. I certainly put a little money in on some different companies that I believed in that I think long term will come back. I wasn't trying to make a quick buck or anything like that. I just
Yeah.
I didn't have much invested in the market, and as long as things were valued at far less than I thought they would ultimately be valued in 30, 40 years, I figured why not.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think the beauty but scary thing about it is that it's becoming ever more easy for us to gain money as kind of like a side hustle through investing. But at
Mhm.
the same time, it's scary because if you think about the financialization of our world and, you know, capital flight, like we invest all these dollars or euros into these developing countries that really need it, and then when things go bad globally, we just pull it right out, and their economies suffer at the end of it. It's kind of like financial colonization to a point.
Mm,
um,
mm.
we're putting a chokehold on some countries, and we don't necessarily intend to do that, but that's what's happening.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, that is not one I think most people think about. Certainly something I haven't thought about. So, yeah, wow, that is interesting. What did you think of on more of the politics side of the market? What do you think of some of these senators selling their stock pre-COVID?
I mean, obviously that's illegal. It's insider trading if you know how it's going to go.
Right.
I don't know the details, honestly, for what you're mentioning, but if you're
Mhm.
selling something before it's made aware to the public, should be indicted probably.
Right. Yeah. I think most of them are in the process of that. I mean,
Okay,
a couple of the
perfect.
senators have stepped down and such, but no, I just think it's interesting because insider trading, it's almost okay in like every other aspect of life except for this. Like, if a friend tips you off, like, hey, they're having a sale over there, run over. Like, nobody's like insider trading. Like, you're not allowed to say that. It's only in like this very niche, specific sense that we were completely against it. So I just find that interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving over back to the Brooklyn aspect, sort of where we started. You're a Brooklyn native and proud of it, which I think you should be. And something I read today in Morning Brew is how many people are leaving New York City, as you mentioned, and last month new apartment leases in Manhattan fell 71%, which isn't totally surprising given how
Mhm.
hard New York City was hit. So my question for you is, how do you think this affects gentrification in the city, and particularly in Brooklyn? Will people seek cheaper housing markets in other parts of the country, or will they search for cheaper, more impoverished neighborhoods in, deep Brooklyn, Queens, or the Bronx?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. I think we've been, if you look at the data for years, are we going to have a great suburbanization, or is everyone just going to live in cities? But for the most part, like supply and demand in terms of housing, especially in New York City, is not what it used to be. I mean, right now the demand is a lot lower because no one wants to move at a time like this, but at the same time, no one's building, so supply is increasing and drops aren't falling. And uh, prices aren't falling due to that. So it's an interesting time. I'm curious to know. My lease is up in uh, end of September, and I have to move again. So who knows what the supply of housing will be then? And I'm hoping I could find an affordable price. But generally, just housing overall is pretty expensive due to things like gentrification and the demand to live in New York City, but
Right.
also the lack of housing.
Right. And affordable housing in particular. I mean,
Affordable, yeah,
there's plenty of
definitely.
skyscrapers that are empty.
Yeah. You're having these mega ghost cities in China because developers rush to create something to generate wealth, but at the same time, like there needs to be a demand to fill that.
Right.
So
Yeah. No, that's definitely it's a scary aspect of sort of the new world that we live in. It's crazy. I mean, there's so much room in this world, and we all stack ourselves in these cities and have no place to live. It's like you go up to the Hudson Valley. There's acres of land. It's just not nobody wants to live there, but a select few want to live there.
Exactly. And I think that goes back into like, culture and the opportunity you can get in a city environment
Yeah.
versus obviously outside. But I think we're going to see a structural shift in that too once working from home is becoming more convenient for companies and people.
Right.
I think the work-life balance has already been in flux for years and people are growing tired of it,
Yeah.
especially me. I mean, if I have the opportunity to work from home now, I'm getting the same work done. Why do we need to lease um, an office space in the city?
Right.
Obviously, for our core business, like teaching students and having them come, that's essential. But why do some people need to go in for a meeting on one day when they can do that from their living room?
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
My only fear with that is that, I mean, such a big part of the city is the hustle and bustle, people coming in, people going out, people leaving their office for lunch, in the area. I mean, there's a lot of exterior elements of the economy there that will be, greatly affected. That classic lunch spot that you go to, can't exist if the office buildings next to it are vacant or are heavily reduced.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I did spend a lot on lunches back in the city, but
Yeah.
I'm looking at my cash flow right now, and it's never been better, to be honest. I've been cooking every day. I haven't been spending on, walking by a store and just buying something because I like it. If anything, I've moved my all my shopping to online except my groceries, and I've really been spending a lot less. So it's been great for me individually, but I'm sure small businesses could also use support, which
Yeah.
I've been trying to do online. It's a lot harder than it is for buying small businesses in person.
Sure.
But yeah, I think when things open up, it should be important to go to like your local stores in your neighborhood and not necessarily go to the. I mean, I would say like Macy's and Walmart, but who knows if they'll be around.
Right. Yeah, I know JCPenney recently filed for bankruptcy, so
I mean, and it's about time, honestly. They've been a struggling company for years. Uh, Nielsen Marcus, I think that was the name of the company in the UK that also filed.
yeah.
Hertz, I
Oh, the
mean,
car?
yeah, yeah, Hertz, the car company. I mean, you're seeing specific sectors really struggle
Right.
for lockdowns. Obviously, travel, retail, construction, and it's all based off like how we're spending our money and not spending our money.
Right. And what's
So
deemed essential and what's not.
exactly. But yeah, the majority of these sectors are people who are working part time or are on the lower scale of the income ladder.
Right.
So I think it's essential that we think about how to get aid out fastly and make it available to those who need it
Mm.
first, which we're trying to do, but it doesn't seem like it's working. Websites crashing and a lot of barriers to entry, but hopefully we can get to a point where it stabilizes and things work.
I certainly hope so. So rounding out here, I don't know if you are people cheering in Brooklyn. Is that something that's happening?
Yep, 7 p.m. to 7:02, I think.
Yeah, so are you hearing it right now? Because people in New York, I just don't want to, I normally do a shofar blast out the window for the healthcare workers. I don't want to interrupt our call here, but I don't know.
No, it's fine. I can't hear them actually. These headphones are pretty good, but
Okay, excellent, good. I don't want to drown out the applause for the healthcare workers, but at a certain point, all right. I mean, we got to focus here. So closing out, I'd like to end my COVID chats with this of late. What are a few things you can't wait to do again?
whew, honestly, just hanging out with my friends and seeing my family. Keep it to the basics. I usually have a Sunday dinner every week, and I haven't been able to see my family, except via Zoom. And same with my friends. Like as you know, we like to hang out, play poker, go
Yeah,
to a bar.
yeah,
So I think that's the first thing I'm probably gonna start doing
mm,
once everything relaxes and it's safe to do so. I mean, we can open up restrictions early, but we have to also make sure it's safe
right.
individually as well.
Right, right. Just because things are open doesn't mean you should go outside.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is tough and is definitely going to be a challenge here in the city. So we'll see how that shakes out. Any closing thoughts for you? Anything we didn't address?
A lot of things we can address, but maybe I'll be in a future chat.
Yeah,
I really like the platform here. You're like the modern day, Jacob Reese, like getting really into the people right now.
thank you.
Super cool to have this space, and yeah, looking forward to seeing you when this all finishes up.
You too, buddy. I'm looking forward to it whenever that date may be. We certainly all need it. And yeah, thank you for the compliment. It's been a pleasure running the program so far. I think it will probably continue through the end of May, and then I'll sort of see what I want to do with it. There's other things I have in mind, but yeah, I mean, it's been good for me, for the future professionally, and then also, on the selfish level, just the the personal connection, talking to people, seeing their faces. It's big as someone who's living alone. You got a roommate, but
Yeah, of course. You're probably talking to more people than you have before.
yeah, I'm talking to myself in the mirror all the time.
I mean, I'm having full-on conversations with my cat, so
There we go. There we
everything's acceptable nowadays.
go. Oh boy. All right.
Uh, all right, thanks for having me.
A pleasure, Thomas. Thank you. Enjoy dinner.
Thanks. See ya.
See you. Bye.